In the previous video, we saw everything about variables and how to measure them and what are the implications of measuring in one way or another. And now we're going to start talking about who we're going to measure that about, or what are going to be the inputs in our study. And in order to talk about that, we need to first talk a bit about distributions. So let's start about two fallacies. The first one is the ecological fallacy. And by the way, you might find that the people used to talk about the Simpsons paradox in here. So let's say we are talking about students in a class, from class A, and we find that they are very good at math. One might say, well, Bob is from class A, therefore Bob has to be very good at math. Well, not necessarily. The fact that most students maybe are very good at math doesn't mean that all of them are very good at math. Any given subject from that group is not necessarily a very good student in math. We also have the exception fallacy, which says something like, hey, if Alice and Bob are very tall and they're Italian, then all Italians must be very tall. Well, not necessarily, right? The fact that two members of this population are very tall doesn't mean that all the members of the population are very tall. And so by extension, we might encounter something like, if the average score in a class is 4, then there must be many students with a score of 4. Well, again, not necessarily. We might even have no student at all with a score of 4. So everything depends on how these variables are distributed across the populations. Everything is about the distributions. So let's start talking about distributions. So a probability distribution is essentially just a function that assigns a certain probability to every possible outcome of a random experiment, such as measuring the score in a test or measuring the height of a person, etc. Now, when we talk about randoming here, we don't mean that the experiment is random, that the outcome is random. It just means that we model it as an experiment, or we build a model around it such that everything that we don't know about the score is looking like random to us. So for instance, if we're interested in the height of people and we know the average of people, then any deviation from that average, it looks like random because we don't have any better explanation for that deviation. We'll talk more about this in a few slides. So let's say, for instance, that we have over here the distribution of test scores. We see that there are many students with a very high score, but it turns out that, for instance, Bob might be around there. So is Bob a very good student in math? Well, not necessarily. There are many in the class, but Bob is not one of them. And over here we have, for instance, a distribution of years of experience of employees. And we might find that, well, there's a lot of people that have more than 10 years experience, a lot of people 1 to 5. Any person might be in one of those categories. We just know how the whole population is distributed, but given any member of that population, well, we're not sure about. So the point about distributions is that we're usually interested in the mean scores. So for example, the mean years of experience or the mean test score in a certain population. And that is what down the road is going to allow us to start talking about effects. So what's going to happen on average in a certain population? Are we going to have a positive effect, a negative effect, a certain magnitude of the effect? Even if there's a certain variation, we know that on average, we expect something positive or negative. We'll talk about it. And so when we talk about distributions and we talk about populations, we need to talk about sampling. Sampling is just the process of selecting certain entities from a population such that by studying the sample, we can infer something about that population. Now, let's imagine that we want to measure something about all people in the country. We don't have access to all people in the country, or it's too expensive. So what we do is select a set of people, let's say 1,000 people, and then we study those 1,000 people. And the point is that we might be able to kind of extrapolate our results from these 1,000 people to all the millions in the country. So why do we want to sample and not just study the whole population? Well, there's many reasons. For example, maybe in the population there are too many items, too many people in this case. We can't afford to run our study on, let's say, 100 million people. Maybe they don't exist anymore or yet. So what about people who are already dead? Or what about people who are not born yet? We can't access those people, but maybe by studying the people who are alive now, or maybe children that are just born, we might be able to extrapolate a little bit the results to others. What about maybe people that are too far away? We can't travel, I don't know, from the East Coast to the West Coast in the US, for example, in order to make a study. Or maybe they are inaccessible to us. Maybe they're prisoners, or maybe it's too expensive to access to them. I don't know. Think about football players. Maybe it's unethical. We shouldn't run certain studies, for instance, on animals or on children or pregnant women. Maybe it's illegal. So there is a wide variety of reasons why it might be impossible for us to run a study on the whole population. So we have to make do with a subset of those. And that's going to be a sample. So let's take a look at the whole thing a little bit more. Let's say we have a target population. So what is the population that we are targeting in our study, the one that is of interest to us? Let's say in our case that it's the whole country. We want to know something about all citizens in the country. And what we do is draw a sample from that population. We will see how we can do this. And let's say we have here, looks like it's 30 people. So we run our study with these 30 people. And then what we do is inference back to the population the results of our study, generalizing from the sample to the population. So if we observe a certain effect on the sample, we infer from that there is that effect in the whole population. So how do we do this? How do we go from a population to a sample? How do we decide who's going to be in our study and who isn't? And when I say who, it depends on your study, of course. If we're interested in people, then those who are people, but maybe they are cars. If we want to study something like fuel consumption, maybe I'm interested in agriculture and I want to measure something about plants. I'm interested in food and I want to measure something about red meat. It just depends on our case. So given a certain population of interest, how do we sample? Well, the point to make here is that the conclusions that we will be able to fairly claim from our result are limited by how we sample. So how we choose who's going to be in our study and who isn't is going to affect our ability to make reasonable claims about how these effects that we observe in our study extrapolate to the population. And there's essentially two aspects of this. One is that the sample has to be representative of the target populations. So it has to somehow represent well enough the population so that they are very similar, and therefore whatever we observe in the sample is expected to also happen in the population. And also they should be large enough such that any small variation in our data, when we look at average effects, we can have a high degree of certainty that whatever we observe is also what we should observe in the population. Again, we're going to talk plenty about this. So what strategies can we follow? Well, the most simple one is just simple random sampling. So let's say we want to study everyone in the country. We just randomly go around and stop people and start asking them questions. Or maybe we have a collection of music in our house. We want to study something about it. We cannot study the whole music collection. We just go around picking CDs and study those albums. Maybe we want to study something about customers in our shop. We just get the full list of customers, randomly select 50, 100, whatever, and then just make the study with those people. The problem, though, is that this is not always as straightforward as it might seem. So think, for example, the difference between calling people in the country by randomly choosing from their social security number or national ID numbers versus just randomly dialing numbers in the phone book. Well, imagine that we are running our study and it's a Wednesday morning. We start calling people at random. In principle, these people are selected randomly, but what we find is that some people pick up the phone, some people don't. So who are the people that are going to pick up the phone? Well, those that are unemployed, probably. Or maybe we find just a tiny proportion of the people who are really employed and just happen that they could pick up the phone at that time. But the point is that something that in principle looks like a random sample, according to phone numbers, in the end might not be a random sample, might be biased towards people who are unemployed because of the whole sampling process. We also have stratified sampling, and this is what we use when we have certain populations in which we know there are certain members of the population that are highly unrepresented. So think again the example about the country. Maybe we want to study something about our citizens. If we just randomly sample people from the country, it's very likely that we pick up people, or most of them are from highly populated cities. We are going to be underrepresenting people from cities who have a low population. How can we avoid such a potential bias? Well, we could say these are the cities, these are the number of people in the cities. We are going to sample always 50 people from every city, for example, so that we know we have 50 people from the most populated city and 50 people from the least populated city, and so on and so forth. So if we look at all members of the sample, it's not really representing our population because we are over-representing the smaller groups, the smaller cities. But what we are ensuring is that we are covering the whole range, the whole population. And then what we have to do is, when we analyze data, weight each of those members, each of those observations accordingly. And so it's going to allow us to ensure there's always going to be people from low populated cities. What other ways we have of sampling? There's something called cluster random sampling. And the idea here is that we may divide the population in clusters. And then what we do is we go to some of those clusters and study everyone in there. So for instance, we might think about the buildings in the city as clusters. And what we do is just go in one building and sample all the people that live in that building, then go to another building and sample all people in that building. Or we might think that in the whole country, then every city is one cluster. And what we do is just go to one city and sample everyone in that cluster. Or if we think about time periods, we might think about the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, etc., and just sample every observation we have in our data about that time period. And finally, we may talk about convenience sampling, which, as the name says, is just a way of sampling that is convenient to us. For instance, we might sample all our friends and the friends of our friends, maybe families, maybe co-workers, things like that. The extent to which those samples are going to represent our populations, well, is debatable, but maybe they do in a certain sense, or that's an assumption that we are willing to accept. Again, we'll talk more about this in a later video.